Good evening. How's everybody doing? It's great to be learning with you on a Thursday. Let's light up the darkness. And who is with us as we're rounding out the week, starting to think about Shabbos? We got Stephen in New Hampshire, Melissa in Great Neck, Paul in the Great Northwest, Bill in Mid-Missouri, Lucy in Minnesota, Paul says Shalom Yehud in South Carolina, Bella in Florida, Sharon in New Jersey, John in Maine, Julia in North Carolina, Donna in Virginia, Renee in Florida, Johnny in Cape Cod. Welcome, everybody. Over there on the YouTube side, Aoife in Florida. Tonight's episode of AT Daily, sponsored by our very own Dr. John Shore, member of our class. And this is dedicated in honor of Michael Ben Chava. John, thank you so much for your support. It means the world to us. May you and all your loved ones, all your beautiful family be showered in blessings, and we say amen. Thank you for enabling us to share more Torah with more people around the world. If you would like to sponsor an episode of AT Daily, donate.accidentaltalmudist.org. We are in our annual campaign. Your support makes everything possible that we do here at Accidental Talmudist. Okay. Where am I? Okay, we're in chapter 3 today, continuing our discussion of Mishna number 2 here in Tractate Nazir, the 17th volume of the Talmud, the laws of one who takes a vow of nazirus, to become a nazir, to abstain from the grapevine, not to cut the hair, not to become impure for the dead, and to bring the offerings of a nazir at the conclusion of the term of nazirus, or to bring the offerings that are required if one who is a Nazir becomes impure. And that's what we've been discussing. What about those offerings? What about if you take the vow of nazirus when you're already impure, or if you're standing in a cemetery where by definition you're impure with corpse tumah? So did the vow of nazirus take effect, right? You can, if you're a nazir, you've held yourself, it was optional, you shouldn't have done it, right? The sages discourage taking unnecessary vows. But if you do, then you're held to the standard of a nazir, and you can't become impure for the dead. You're not supposed to touch any dead body. You can't help, right, at a funeral. You can't attend the cemetery. So what are you doing taking such a vow while you're standing in a cemetery? And what are the consequences of it? So Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish are arguing what happens when somebody's standing in a cemetery and takes a vow of nazirus. So Rabbi Yochanan says that the vow takes effect. You don't start counting days until you've left the cemetery and gone through a 7-day purification, and so that you are in a state of purity, and then you can start counting days of nazirus, but the vow takes effect. And Reish Lakish argues and says, no, if you're standing in a cemetery, it's like a nonsense vow. It makes no sense, so nothing even happened. The vow doesn't take effect. It's meaningless words. But the law is like Rabbi Yochanan, so the vow will kick in when you leave the cemetery and go through the purification process. Okay, we picked this up. Today's daf is page 17. We picked this up a few lines from the top of 17a. As a result of this question, so what happens when you make this vow while you're standing in a cemetery? And we saw one interpretation of this dispute because there's other aspects of it. Does the vow take effect? Are you subject to lashes, right? Will you get flogged? And remember, whenever we talk about lashes, it's not like, oh my God, the person, wasn't religious enough and we take out the whip and whip him. But when you violate a law that it would have a penalty of lashes, you're only going to get the lashes if somebody was standing right there and said to you, if you do that, you're going to get law. You're going to get flogged, right? You're going to get lashes. And then the person does it anyway and does it immediately and does it in the presence of two witnesses. And all these people came to court and testified about it. So it's not that this really happens very often, if ever. But the point is that lashes would apply in such a situation. So a Nazir who allows himself to become impure for the dead, or who shaves his head prematurely, or who drinks wine during his term of nazirus, would be subject to lashes for violating a Torah prohibition. Well, what about one who takes this vow while standing in a cemetery? Has he immediately taken on a vow and violated it? Is he subject to lashes? We're examining this question. So now the Gemara offers a different interpretation of the dispute between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. So Mar bar Rav Ashi said, the dispute between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish is not like we stated at the end of yesterday. With regard to the question of the vow of nazirus taking effect, everyone agrees that it takes effect from the moment of his acceptance of nazirus, even if he is standing in a cemetery. So according to this interpretation, Reish Lakish would agree that if you utter your vow of nazirus while standing in a cemetery, your vow takes effect. You can't start counting days until you leave the cemetery, become pure again, and are in a state of purity. But the thing that you uttered, you're going to be bound by. You will be obligated by that vow. And Reish Lakish would agree with Rabbi Yochanan on that, in this interpretation of the dispute between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. So rather, says Mar bar Rav Ashi, when Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish disagree, it is with regard to being flogged, receiving lashes for violating the Torah prohibition. And it's like this. Rabbi Yochanan holds that since the vow takes effect, he is therefore flogged for becoming impure. And Reish Lakish holds that he is not flogged for becoming impure, but the vow does take effect with regard to the prohibitions of nazirus. And according to this version of the dispute as well, Rabbi Yochanan raised an objection to Reish Lakish from the Mishna, which states, one who took a vow of nazirus while standing in a cemetery, even if he was there for a full 30 days without leaving, those days that he spent in the cemetery do not count as part of his tally. Right? He took a vow. He didn't say how long he's going to be a Nazir for. So the default duration of Nazirus, which is unspecified, is 30 days. So even if he stood in that cemetery without leaving it for 30 days, none of those days count toward, even though he didn't drink and he didn't shave his head, but he wasn't in a state of purity, which he needs to be in order for his days of Nazirus to count. So none of those days count, says our Mishnah. And Rabbi Yochanan is raising this as an objection, right? One who takes a vow of Nazirus while in a cemetery, even if he was there for a full 30 days without leaving, those days he spent in the cemetery do not count as part of his tally, since his Nazirus has not yet gone into effect. And he therefore does not bring the offerings of impurity despite having been in a cemetery, right? A Nazir who was in a normal situation, he's in a state of purity when he utters his vow, and then he counts as many days as he remains pure. And then if he becomes impure by a corpse, or he enters a cemetery and becomes impure by a corpse, so then all the days that come before are negated, as we learned, and he has to bring the offerings of a Nazir who became impure for the dead. But if he was never pure to begin with, because he was standing in the cemetery when he uttered the vow, then he doesn't bring those offerings of a Nazir who becomes impure, because he didn't become impure. He started impure. And Rabbi Yochanan infers from this, it is offerings of impurity that he does not bring. But he is flogged for contracting impurity, which is not in accordance with the opinion of Reish Lakish. Right? So what Rabbi Yochanan is saying is, well, that what they could have said, he utters his vow while standing in a cemetery, and so, he's guilty of a transgression. But what they said instead in our Mishnah is his days don't count for him. Okay, his days don't count for him, but he is flogged for becoming impure while being a Nazir because his vow took effect. So the Gemara answers, this inference is not correct, as by right, the Mishnah should teach he is not flogged. But due to the fact that the anonymous rabbi of the Mishnah wants to teach the latter clause of the Mishnah, which states, if he left the cemetery and he entered it again, those days do count as part of his tally, meaning the nazirus takes effect, and when he left the cemetery, became pure, then whatever days, he had as pure days, those are counted as part of his tally. Then when he re-enters the cemetery, boom, he loses those days because he became impure while a nazir. So the Tana of our Mishnah, is wanting to explain that clause, that the latter clause of our Mishnah, that if he left the cemetery and entered it again, those days do count as part of his tally, meaning the nazirus does take effect. And he does bring the offerings of impurity for re-entering the cemetery. And because he needed to teach that, the Tana therefore taught a similar phrasing in the first clause of our Mishnah, that he does not bring the offerings of impurity when he utters his vow of nazirus while standing in a cemetery. But if he leaves and comes back, then he does have to give the offerings of impurity. But that's not to say that he's flogged or not flogged, right? The Tana of this Mishnah is just not addressing the question of whether this Nazir is flogged or not for uttering his vow while standing in a cemetery. So the Gemara is saying, Rabbi Yochanan, you're wrong to bring that as a proof that the guy is flogged. So the Gemara suggests another proof in support of Rabbi Yochanan's opinion. Come in here a proof from another Baraisa. The difference between an impure person who took a vow of nazirus and a pure nazir who became impure, right? So the two cases that we're comparing, somebody, normal case, he's in a state of purity, he takes a vow of nazirus, he starts counting days, and then he becomes impure. What's going to happen to him? He's going to have to bring the offerings of a nazir who became impure. He's going to have to go through the 7-day purification process of one who became impure for the dead. And once he's completed that 7-day purification and brought the offerings of the nazir who became impure, then he can start counting days again, and he has to complete his entire term of nazirus. As opposed to one who was impure at the time that he uttered his vow of nazirus, like somebody standing in a cemetery. So this Baraisa is saying the difference between an impure person who took a vow of nazirus, like by standing in a cemetery when he took it, and a nazir who is pure and then became impure, what is the difference between them? It is only with respect to the following law, that in the case of an impure person who took a vow of nazirus, his 7th day of purification counts as part of his tally of the term of nazirus. But in the case of a pure nazir who became impure, his 7th day of purification does not count as part of his tally. And the Gemara infers, but with regard to flaw, and why is that? Because the one who started impure, and then he has to go through a purification process, but he never had any pure days before. So as soon as he finishes his purification process, he can start counting days of nazirus. His purification is simply purification from being tamei, right, ritually impure, because he touched the dead. Once he's completed that purification, he starts counting his days of nazirus. The nazir who was pure and then became impure, he has to go through that same 7-day purification, and when he completes it, he can't start counting days of nazirus yet because he still has to bring the offerings of a nazir who became impure. Right? As we already learned, the guy who started impure when he made his vow of nazirus, once he finishes that purification, he doesn't bring the offerings of a nazir who became impure because he never had any pure days before he became impure. Right? And so it's almost like a little bit of an advantage to him that as soon as he finishes his 7-day purification from being tamei for a corpse, he can start immediately counting days of nazirus on his 7th day of that purification. Whereas the nazir who was pure and became impure has to go through the same 7-day purification, but as soon as he's completed with that, he can't start counting days of nazirus yet because he still has to bring the offerings in the temple of a nazir who became impure. Okay, that's the difference. So you can see that the Gemara is offering, well, if that's the only difference between those two guys, well then, whether they're flogged or not flogged, apparently they're going to be in the same situation If the only difference between them is when they can start counting days of nazirus again, apparently they are not different with respect to flogging. That's the nature of this proof. Right, so if you left the cemetery, so another proof that in the case of the impure person who took the vow of nazirus, his 7th day counts as part of his tally of the term of nazirus. But in the case of a pure nazir who became impure, his 7th day of purification does not count as part of his tally. And from this, the Gemara infers, but with regard to flogging, the nazir, this nazir and that nazir are equal. And Reish Lakish said to Rabbi Yochanan, this is not a correct inference. You can't draw that inference from the fact that there's a baraisa that says the only difference is after they become pure from the corpse tumah, one can start counting his days of nazirus immediately and the other one has to bring the offerings first. That's not, you can't infer from that the only difference with them, that baraisa might only be saying, well, with respect to counting days, that's the only difference between them. But there might be other differences between these two cases. Right, so Reish Lakish says to Rabbi Yochanan, this is not a correct inference. Rather, it is with regard to shaving on the 7th day of purification that this nazir and that nazir are equal, since even a ritually impure person who took a vow of nazirus must shave on that day. Even one who is in the middle of nazirus when he's prohibited to shave, but he became impure by touching a corpse, he has to go through that 7-day purification, and at the end of that 7-day purification, another thing he's got to do is shave. I forgot that, but okay. And that's even if he's a nazir, and certainly if he's not a nazir. When you go through that 7-day purification, you got to shave afterward. So the Gemara suggests, come and hear a proof from that which is taught in a baraisa. So the Gemara asks, but in that case, according to Reish Lakish, what is the law with regard to flogging? This nazir is flogged, and that nazir who is ritually impure when he vowed is not flogged? If so, let him teach this difference as well. Why does the baraisa state that there is only one difference between them? And the Gemara answers, the baraisa is speaking of his remedy. It is not speaking of a matter that is detrimental to him. Consequently, the baraisa does not discuss a nazir's punishments and discusses only the means by which he can resume his observance of nazirus. You know, just to step back for a second, we're learning something very important principle, right? When people are arguing, all the time they use little, syllogisms. Is that the right word? I mean, they say things that appear to be logical conclusions from that which came before, and if you challenge it, you realize, oh, no, that's not so at all, right? So, for example, something that you'll often hear from skeptics of scripture, right? Atheists or agnostics or people who just don't believe that the Bible is a true document. And they will say, there's no archaeological evidence that, there was a Jewish exodus from Egypt. Therefore, it didn't happen. And you're like, well, wait a minute. There's no archaeological evidence? If there was archaeological evidence, maybe that would prove that it did happen, but the absence of archaeological evidence does not prove that it didn't happen, right? I mean, obviously, over 3,000 years ago, a bunch of people who left and walked through a place, there doesn't necessarily have to be archaeological evidence of that. Many things are lost in the sands of time. And the fact that, we have found archaeological evidence of some events, okay, so we know they happen, doesn't mean that if there's an absence of archaeological evidence that it didn't happen. Likewise here, the fact that a particular teaching addresses one aspect of a law does not imply that that's the only aspect of the law that is worth studying or that will have an impact on a person, who's affected by this law. What is mentioned is mentioned. What is left out, maybe it was left out for a reason. Maybe it was omitted because it doesn't exist. But we can't make logical inferences without strong evidence or without strong reason, right? So that's what they're testing here. There's very much there's this idea that Talmudic reasoning sharpens your thinking. And this is one of those examples, right? The fact that a law says the only difference between a person in this case and a person in that case has to do with when they shave or when they don't shave doesn't mean that therefore they're equal in every other respect. It's just you have to come and ask, what context was that particular teaching written in? What subject was being addressed? What comparison were they trying to make? And the fact that they didn't make other comparisons doesn't mean that other comparisons don't exist. Okay. So the Gemara further suggests, come in here a different proof from that which is taught in a baraisa. One who was ritually impure, tamei, and he took a vow of nazirus, must still observe the laws of a nazir. He is prohibited from shaving and from drinking wine. And if he shaved, or if he drank wine, or if he became ritually impure for a corpse, he incurs the 40 lashes administered to one who actively transgresses a negative Torah prohibition. And the Gemara concludes, this is a conclusive refutation of the opinion of Reish Lakish, as explained by Mar bar Rav Ashi, right? The fact that a different teaching omitted to state how else these guys are comparable doesn't mean that they're not comparable, right? So in this case, we learn from that baraisa that, you know, one who is in a state of impurity, now it might be because he touched a corpse, or it might be because he touched a creeping thing, or it was a woman and she was menstruating, or a man, he had a gonorrheal discharge, that also makes you impure, right? So while you are impure, and we'll see more about this soon, you can't count days of nazirus, but even though you can't count the days, it doesn't suspend your nazirus, right? So even though you can't count those days because you're in a state of impurity, you remain prohibited to drink wine, to shave your hair, and even to touch a corpse, right? So even if you become impure by touching a corpse, you have to go through that purification. That doesn't mean, well, okay, now I can go, help bury anyone who needs to be buried that day in the cemetery, because you remain prohibited to do that, even if you are tamei through corpse tumah. Now, after concluding that one who takes a vow of nazirus while in a cemetery, that this person is liable to receive lashes, so Rava asks, what is the law if one took a vow to be a nazir while standing in a cemetery? Well, we just learned that. Is it necessary that his exit from the cemetery be delayed for a specific period of time for him to become liable to receive lashes, just as one who becomes ritually impure while in the temple receives lashes only if he remains there for a specific period of time, or is it not necessary? Meaning, is there a minimum measure? In this case, the measure is time. So is there a minimum amount of time that he has to, be standing in the cemetery after he took that vow for him to become liable to receive lashes? Or is it just the fact that he was standing in a cemetery, maybe like he didn't realize he was in a cemetery when he said it, and then as soon as he said it, he's like, oh my gosh, I'm in a cemetery, and he jumped over the line. He was standing right at the border. It was maybe that's such a minimal degree of violating this law that he's not liable to lashes. So is there a minimum measure? And the Gemara clarifies, what are the circumstances in which this question is relevant? If we say that they said to him in warning, do not take a vow of nazirus in the cemetery, and he ignored their warning and he took a vow of nazirus, why do I need him to delay his exit? What difference does it make how long he stands there? If he was warned and he took the vow anyway while standing in a cemetery, he should receive lashes. Now, what is the reason that one who was already a nazir when he entered a cemetery does not need to delay his exit in order to be liable to receive lashes, right? One who's already a nazir, if he takes sets 1 foot inside the cemetery, he has violated his nazirus. He's going to become impure. He's going to have to bring the offerings of impurity, and he's going to get lashed for it if he was warned and did it anyway. Right? What is the reason that one who was already a nazir when he entered a cemetery does not need to delay his exit, meaning there's no minimum measure to receive lashes? Because they warn him not to enter, and if he enters, he has transgressed a prohibition and he's flogged. Well, here too, if they warned him not to take that vow of nazirus while standing in a cemetery, and he did it anyway, so he should therefore be liable to receive lashes if he does take that vow. Now in 17b. So rather, Rava's question about this minimum measure should be understood to refer to a case. Now here we're getting like, what? Who brought in this? And it's in order to understand Rava's question, they're going to create some, a colorful scenario that would justify asking this question. So Rava's question should be understood to refer to a case where one entered the cemetery in a chest, a box, or a cabinet. meaning not a dead person entering the cemetery in a coffin, but for some reason, a person was carried into the cemetery inside a chest or a box or a cabinet, meaning a large wooden container. And why is this relevant? Because a sealed wooden container does not contract tumah. The inside, the interior of that sealed box will not contract tumah that it's, where that box is riding over, right? So if you walk over a grave, you got corpse tumah. But if you're in a box that's sealed and you pass over that grave, like in a stagecoach, for example, and you pass over a grave, so you didn't contract tumah. The wood will prevent the tumah from reaching you. So one can enter a cemetery in such a container without becoming impure. If one was carried into a cemetery inside one of these containers and then took a vow of nazirus, so he's not impure. He's protected. Even though he's standing in a cemetery, he's not impure because of the box. So the vow should take effect and he could start counting days, right? But then another person came and removed the top of his wood box. Now it's not a sealed box anymore. So you see, remember, it's not just that there's wood between you and the tumah. That's not enough. You have to be in a sealed box. Now that somebody else came and opened the box, now he's not in a sealed box. He just became tamei because he's standing in a cemetery. So now he becomes ritually impure because he's in that cemetery. So if he was then warned, he already took the vow. But if he's warned to leave the cemetery, the question is like this. When we learn by tradition that one is liable to receive lashes for delaying his exit, does that apply only to the temple? But out, because you're not allowed to be in the holy temple if you're impure. So if you realize that you're impure while you're standing in the temple, you got to get the heck out. And if you delay getting out, then you're going to have a bigger penalty. So this question of delaying and when you're impure, does that only count in the temple? Or what about a Nazir in a cemetery who is a Nazir? He entered because he was in a sealed wood box in a state of purity. Now the box is open. So does he need to get out without delaying in order to avoid, this triggering the lashes or not? Right. So when we learn, when we learn by tradition that one is liable to receive lashes for delaying his exit, does that apply only to the temple? But outside the temple, such as when a Nazir is in a cemetery, does the law not apply? So that he is liable to receive lashes even if he did not delay his exit? Or perhaps it is not different. And a Nazir in a cemetery is flogged only if he remains there for a specific period of time. What's the answer? We don't know. That question was left unresolved. New subject. Rav Ashi raises a dilemma. If one took a vow of nazirus while in a cemetery, is he required to shave upon becoming ritually pure before starting his term of nazirus or not? And the Gemara explains the two sides of the question. When a ritually impure Nazir is required to shave before starting his tally, does that refer only to a ritually pure Nazir who became impure, who has defiled his nazirus, right? He took the normal vow. He was pure when he took the vow. He started counting days. Then he accidentally walked into a cemetery, became impure for the dead. Now he has to go through that 7-day purification. And when he finishes that purification, there's a shaving that is involved with just purifying from coming into contact with the dead. So he has to do that. What about one who took the vow while he was already impure? Now his vow won't kick in the sense of counting days until he leaves the cemetery, has a 7-day purification, and then the vow starts. Now does he need to shave from the purification? Sounds like he does, right? When a ritually impure Nazir is required, so a ritually pure, a Nazir who becomes, it's not that every person who touches the dead has to shave. It's a Nazir who becomes impure for the dead. He has to shave and start his days over again, and then he'll shave again when he completes his Nazirus. Okay, so this guy who was pure, became a Nazir, went into a cemetery, came out, did 7 days of purification, then he has to shave his head, and then he could start counting days again and complete his nazirus. What about the one who uttered the vow while he was already in a cemetery? Does he need to shave after the 7 days? But a ritually impure person who only took a vow of nazirus and whose nazirus has not yet begun, is he not obligated to shave? Or perhaps it's the same for them. And the Gemara suggests, come and hear a proof from the Mishna. One who took a vow of nazirus while in a cemetery, even if he was there for a full 30 days without leaving, those days he spent in the cemetery do not count as part of his tally, since his nazirus has not yet gone into effect, and he therefore does not bring the offerings of impurity. And the Gemara infers from this is the offerings of impurity that he does not bring. But he is required to shave. And what's the Gemara going to do? Reject this proof. Just because it only mentioned bringing offerings of impurity doesn't mean that therefore the laws of shaving apply the same to this guy who took his vow of nazirus while standing in a cemetery. We don't know. The Gemara rejects this proof. It is possible that the Mishna is saying, what is the reason? Meaning why he doesn't bring offerings of impurity. What is the reason he does not bring the offerings of impurity? Because he does not require shaving. And this indicates that the nazirus has not yet begun, and therefore he doesn't bring the offerings either. Now the Gemara suggests a different proof. Come in here, a proof from another baraisa. The difference between a ritually impure person who took a vow of nazirus and a ritually pure nazir who became impure is only with respect to this law, which we heard already today. With regard to an impure person who took a vow of nazirus, he's standing in the cemetery, his 7th day of purification counts as part of his tally of the term of nazirus, because he doesn't have to bring offerings of impurity. So as soon as he completes the 7 days, he can start counting days of nazirus. As opposed to one who was pure, became a nazir, then became impure. He has to go through the 7-day purification, and then the next day he has to bring the offerings of impurity. So he can't start counting days of his tally of nazirs until he's brought those offerings. And this baraisa told us that that's the only difference with respect to these two people. But that's not the only difference. It's just the only difference with respect to this subject. So the Gemara infers, what? Is it not so that with regard to shaving after the 7 days of purification, this and that, the one who was pure when he made the vow and the one who was impure when he made the vow, that they are equal with respect to shaving? And the Gemara rejects this. No, there is a different inference that we can make from this law. It is with regard to flogging that they are equal. But one who took a vow of nazirus while in a cemetery does not have to shave, like the other one does have to shave. So the Gemara questions this answer. But what is the law concerning shaving? Does this one, who became ritually impure, shave, and that one, who vowed while in a cemetery, not shave? If so, let him teach the Tana of the Mishna should teach this difference as well. And the Gemara answers, the Tana taught his 7th day and all matters relevant to it, including the law of shaving. So once it says that the 7th day is part of the tally of a ritually impure nazir who became pure, it can be inferred that he does not bring the offerings of impurity on the 8th day, and therefore that he does not bring the offerings of impurity on the 8th day, and therefore he does not shave on the 7th day. I think that's a mistake. It can be inferred that he brings his offerings of impurity on the 8th day, and therefore he does not shave on the 7th day. Maybe that's what they're saying. I'm not sure. The Gemara further suggests, come in here a proof from the following baraisa. I have derived only that a nazir's days of ritual impurity do not count as part of his tally. From where do I derive that his days of confirmed Tzaraas, in a case where a nazir became a metzora during his term, do not count toward his tally of nazir? We know that if a nazir becomes impure for the dead, then all of his days that he counted of nazirus prior to becoming impure for the dead, they get negated. And while he's impure, until he goes through that 7-day purification and finishes it, all of those days don't count for his nazirus either. Only once he's fully pure again can he start counting days to fulfill his obligation of a term of nazirus, often for 30 days. What about if somebody becomes impure not for the dead, not for a corpse, but a different form of impurity, like a metzora, right? So we don't have this condition anymore, but in ancient times, when we were at a higher spiritual level, people sometimes suffered from Tzaraas, right? And one who is suffering from Tzaraas, which is a physical manifestation of a spiritual malady, is called a metzora. So a metzora becomes a confirmed metzora. He might be a metzora, even if it's completely obvious, even if like the guy's an expert and has seen the symptoms of Tzaraas and knows that's Tzaraas, he's not a confirmed metzora until a priest comes who presumably has some expertise in this subject and says, yes, you are a metzora. Then he's a confirmed metzora. Now, once he's a confirmed metzora, he is definitely tamei. Until he's confirmed, he might be tamei. Now he's for sure tamei. So ritually impure. Now, when a Nazir becomes ritually impure, the clean days before he became tamei still count as part of his tally toward nazirus. While he's impure, those days don't count until he completes the purification, in this case for Tzaraas, and then he can start counting again. But the difference between corpse tumah and Tzaraas tumah is that the corpse tumah negates all the days he already counted, and the Tzaraas tumah does not negate clean days that he already counted that were also free from wine and shaving toward his tally for nazirus, right? So Tzaraas tumah or some other kind of tumah that's not corpse tumah, those days don't count, but they don't negate the days that came before. And how do we know that? That's the question that's being asked now. And it would seem that by right, it should be so. It makes sense that it's like this. Just as at the end of his days of ritual impurity, the Nazir shaves and brings offerings for corpse tumah, so too at the end of his days of confirmed Tzaraas. The law is that he shaves and brings offerings for his Tzaraas. And this comparison can be extended. Just as the days of his ritual impurity do not count as part of his tally, so too his days of confirmed Tzaraas do not count as part of his tally. And the Brisa continues, no. If you say with regard to his days of ritual impurity, in that case it is because with them, the previous days of nazirus observed in ritual purity are negated. Therefore, those days do not count as part of his tally. But will you say the same with regard? So in other words, since the days, if you become, tamei by virtue of stepping in a cemetery, the days that you're impure don't count, and all the previous days are negated. But since if you become impure from Tzaraas, your previous days are not negated, how do we know that your days while you're impure don't count toward your nazirus? Since they don't have the same law with respect to previous days being negated, why should we think that also it's true that those days that you're impure don't count for your nazirus? Where was I? Do not count, but will you say the same with regard to the days of confirmed Tzaraas, which do not negate the previous days? If 30 days, enough time for his hair to regrow, remain in his term of Nazirs after becoming purified from his Tzaraas, the days before he contracted Tzaraas are not negated. It is therefore possible to argue that they do count as part of his tally. So the Brisa continues, but you can say that just as with regard to a Nazir who was in the grave, meaning a cemetery, whose hair is fit for shaving, that those days spent in the cemetery do not count as part of his tally. His days of confirmed Tzaraas, which are not fit for counting as part of his tally, required for the shaving, since he must first shave as part of the purification process for his Tzaraas, right? Metzora also shaves when he completes his purification, just like one with corpse tumah shaves. Like a Nazir shaves. So is it not all the more so that they do not count as part of his tally? So the Gemara now attempts to prove from the Baraisa that one who took, and I'm almost done, so if you have questions or comments, get them in. The Gemara now attempts to prove from the Baraisa that one who took a vow of nazirus while in a cemetery must shave at the close of his process of purification. Now what? Is it not so that when the Baraisa mentions shaving, it is referring to the shaving of impurity, and it is teaching that one who took a vow of nazirus while standing in a cemetery must shave at the end of his purification process? The Gemara rejects this. No, it is referring to the shaving of purity, meaning the shaving done after one completes his term of nazirus. Then he will shave all of his hair, including that which grew during the time he was ritually impure due to his presence in the cemetery. And the Gemara adds, so too it is reasonable to say that it is the correct interpretation, as if it enters your mind to say that the Baraisa is discussing the shaving done as a result of the nazirus's impurity, and contrasts a nazir with a metzora due to the end of a metzora's days of confirmed tzaraas not require shaving. A metzora must shave when he is purified from his condition. So who shaves? A nazir who completes his nazirus, a nazir who becomes impure for the dead, goes through a purification process, then he shaves, and then he starts over his nazirus, and then he'll shave again at the end of his nazirus. And a metzora, one who had Tzaraas, who completes, who's deemed, the priest says you no longer have Tzaraas. Then he has to go through a purification that involves immersing in the mikveh, counting days, and shaving. So these are the people who have to shave. Right? So a leper must shave when he is purified from his condition. So how can he be described as unfit for shaving? So rather, the Baraisa must be referring to the Nazir's shaving of purity, as suggested above. And the Gemara rejects this. No, it could be that the Baraisa is discussing the shaving done as a result of the Nazir's impurity. And when it states that a metzora is unfit for shaving, the Baraisa is teaching about the shaving of nazirus. And the Baraisa is stating that a metzora is unfit for any shaving of a nazir, since he must first shave for his tzaraas. Complicated, difficult to follow. The bottom line is we're discussing what happens when you have conflicting obligations. And do they conflict? They're trying to figure out if you have dual obligations, do they conflict? And if they conflict, what are we going to do about it? Like we had two terms of nazirus that are consecutive, or one interrupts the other. Or if you become impure while you're a nazir, if you become impure for the dead, the Torah spells out what you have to do. If you become impure of Tzaraas, and you need to shave at the end of that, but you're not allowed to shave while you're a nazir, that's where you get this conflicting obligation. Okay, let's go to questions or comments. On Nazir 17. What's going on here? Nazir 17. Paula, would there not be any way to escape the lash if liable for lashes? Well, it's an interesting question, right? You're only going to be liable to lashes if you were warned that you're about to commit a transgression that will result in lashes, and then you do it anyway, and you do that in the presence of witnesses. So you can certainly escape the lashes by when you were warned, right? It's not you. It can never be that you say, I didn't know. I didn't know that if I did that, I would be liable to receive lashes. Because the only time you're liable to receive lashes is when you were warned that you would receive them. And not only were you warned that you would receive lashes, you were warned immediately before you did it. Like the amount of time I think the definition is the amount of time it takes to greet one's teacher. That's how little time has to precede the transgression from the warning. The warning has to be immediately before the transgression. If at that point you did it anyway and you did so in the presence of witnesses, well, maybe you can't get out of it at that point. Or maybe, they're going to have to take you to court. It's not like the one who warned you just whips you. No, then they have to take you to court. They have to present the evidence, state the case, etc. And who knows? Every court case is like an NFL football game. On any given Sunday, you never know. You hope the truth will come out. You hope that the truth will prevail. But, maybe you can get out of lashes. I don't know. Bill, also, the Exodus, and indeed pretty well all of the Tanakh up until the Babylonian exile, would have happened during a period we know as the Bronze Age collapse, when all the major powers in the Eastern Mediterranean, Western Asia sort of collectively collapsed over the course of centuries, and with them, all of their records. It's the "here there be dragons" action of the timeline, right? In other words, Bill is addressing what I said before. You have to be careful when people present logical arguments that actually aren't logical, right? It sounds like there's no archeological evidence that such and such a thing happened, therefore it didn't happen. Well, that doesn't make sense. You can say there is archeological evidence that something happened. Okay, that's proof that it happened. But the lack of archaeological evidence doesn't mean it didn't happen. It just means that if it happened, the evidence was lost. And, when we're talking about thousands of years, it's not so surprising that such evidence could be lost. Bill, so would a closed sedan chair count as a chest if it is completely made of wood and completely closed? And can the boxed Nazir just close the box and therefore restore his protection? He could restore the protection, but once it was opened, boom, he was in a cemetery and he became impure. Maybe closing it would get him out of the delay penalty, right? That he needs to get out of the cemetery right away to not trigger the lashes. But that he became impure happened as soon as the box was opened. Does a closed sedan chair count as a sealed box? I don't know. They said chest, cabinet, or box. Cabinet makes me feel like maybe, right? Because a cabinet by definition has a door that opens and closes. And a sedan chair sounds kind of like that. So sounds good, but I'm not sure. And finally, Joseph, I would think none of this would apply in the day of resurrection. Do the sages ever comment on matters of impurity in the world to come? Right, so you asked a mouthful there, Joseph. That's a big can of worms. But what Joseph is talking about here is, when you die, there's sort of two next worlds, right? There's a next world, but there's two kinds of next world. And I don't mean a good place and a bad place. What I mean is there's the world of souls where when we leave, this corporeal existence, we return to the world of souls that we came from. And very much Judaism teaches that there will be a resurrection of the dead when Mashiach comes. Now, when Mashiach comes, our tradition teaches he will also bring the third temple, right? So when Mashiach comes and all the dead are resurrected, the temple will also return into existence. So when the temple is back in our midst, and presumably there will be a red heifer that will come along with it. Some traditions hold that, the red heifer will come first. Why do you need a red heifer? A perfectly red cow with no other blemishes. There have only been 9 in all of Jewish history. And not in the last 2,000 years. But when you need a red heifer so that you can go through the procedure of slaughtering it and burning it, and those ashes are mixed with water in a special way, and that people who become tamei for the dead need to be sprinkled with the water of purification in order to become pure again, right? So I guess maybe I'm digressing a little. Maybe Joseph, what you're asking me is, if all the dead are resurrected, is there going to be such a thing as tumah of the corpse? If there are no dead people anymore, does that mean that there will be no more corpse tumah? Great question. And I'm not sure that the tradition says that all of the dead will be resurrected. I don't know about that. Maybe not everybody. Who's included, who's not, completely outside the scope of tonight's class. I'm not sure. But it's a great question. And finally, Sharon, it would seem that one who is impure due to Tzaraas should not have their days count, as their impurity is due to their behavior. And impurity may not be due to their own, an impurity impurity of a corpse may not be due to their own behavior, yet their days don't count. It seems unjust. Very good. So Sharon's making a beautiful analogy. She's saying that, if when a Nazir contracts corpse tumah, right, that could happen by accident. It might even happen, in fact, the Torah says, because somebody dies suddenly right next to him. Right? Somebody has a heart attack right next to him. He's trying to help them. He's trying to revive them, giving them CPR. And then while he's doing that, the person dies. So, he just touched a dead person. He was being heroic, trying to do a good thing, but completely through circumstances outside of his control, he became tamei from a corpse. And as we learned, his previous days are negated, and the days that he is impure from the corpse don't count toward his tally. Whereas one who becomes a metzora, the tradition holds that why did one become a metzora? Because of their behavior, right? it's a physical manifestation of a spiritual malady. They did something wrong. Often it's associated with lashon hara, gossip mongering, right? So the one who became a metzora, that was his fault. Whereas the one who became tamei for the corpse, that wasn't his fault. If the days of corpse tumah aren't going to count toward your tally, all the more the days of being a metzora, which are your fault, shouldn't count toward your tally. In terms of the fact that being dead for a corpse negates your previous days and being a metzora doesn't negate your previous days, that becomes a challenge to your kal v'chomer argument. But it's a good argument. That's all I've got for today. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow. It's a Friday, so the regular Friday time is noon Pacific as we're getting ready for